Se escucha.
Today we have Dr. Sarav Arunachalam. Sorry if I.
You were
He came from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the director of the EPA-funded CMA Center, which provides air quality modeling tools, training, and technical support to large international user community. He's also research professor at UNC and director of the Center for Environmental Modeling for Policy Development at the UNC Institute for the Environment. His work spans emissions and multi-scale air quality modeling with a focus on atmospheric chemistry, source apportionment, and health risk assessment. And he has been recognized with awards from the US EPA and the Department of Transportation, among a lot of other things that he has on his CV. So thanks a lot for being here, Sarav. And he's going to talk about high resolution air quality and health risk modeling of air pollution in a large megacity in the US. So please, thanks a lot. Yes.
Since it is online as well, do we need to stand anywhere or?
No, we could change the camera. You want to see it or you want to stay?
No, I'm fine. I just wasn't sure how the camera was working. So, okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And thank you to the ChimSur team and Professor Andrea for the invitation to come spend some time here. And it's been an amazing few days for me already. Look forward to spending more time with her and the group here. It's a beautiful city. I'm enjoying it very nicely. This is my first time in Argentina. I've come to South America, to Brazil a few times, to Colombia a couple of times, but Argentina is my first time. It was the furthest south I've traveled. So thank you for the hospitality and for all the wonderful collaboration. With that, what I'm going to do in the next half an hour or so is to talk about a high resolution air quality modeling tool, which also takes you from emissions to air quality to health risk in a large megacity in the US, which is New York City. You'll hear very shortly. And what I'll do is it's going to be a combination of multiple domains that we will span, from emissions to atmospheric chemistry to air quality modeling to public health to monetization. So it spans multiple disciplines. I'll be touching upon a lot of different things very briefly, but I'm happy to stop, answer questions depending on what your interests are. But I do want to mention that it's a lot of different topics, and I'll try to cram all of that into a short presentation. Hopefully you'll appreciate the necessity of a tool like this and why we need something like this for cities of the world. With that, the motivation is largely on the transportation sector. In the US, transportation is increasingly large share of health-harming emissions. In the past 2 to 3 decades, it used to be industrial sources, but due to heavy regulation in the US, the industrial sources have come down in their importance, and the transportation sector has taken over as the most important sector. If you look at the emissions magnitudes, 50% of NOx emissions in the overall man-made emissions budget is the NOx, and then 6% for VOCs and 4% for primary fine particulate matter. And these contribute to multiple pollutants. The 3 most important ones are fine particulate matter, ozone, and NO2, which all have adverse health impacts, and it has multiple adverse health impacts from mobility-based impacts, asthma, hospital admissions, and so on, to premature deaths. Heavy-duty diesel vehicles pollute disproportionately. If you look at the number of vehicles in the US, they are a very small percent, only 3%. But the emissions-wise, they contribute to a large percent of the total NOx emissions, right? 40% of on-road mobile is NOx because of the diesel fuel that is used. These continue to grow quite a bit from mobile sources. By the year 2045, they expect to be a third of the total emissions in the US. And if you keep going to the year 2045, 89% of the total on-road sector is expected to be from the heavy diesel vehicles. Now, why is this important? If you look at the population spread in the US, depending on where they live, we have a good 45 million people, which is about 1/6 or 1/7, depending on which number you count, of US live within 100 meters of a major road. Okay, that's a very large population. Of that, children who are the most vulnerable to air pollution, 2 million children attend schools are located within 200 meters of a major roadway. So that's sort of the risk that we have for people living next to a highway. Traffic-related air pollution has short radius, which means from the highway to where people live, the gradient is rather short. Within the first 50 to 100 meters is where you have a very large exposure. But once you go beyond 100 to 200 meters, you're almost at the background levels. So it's this very near road exposure, which is important for people who live next to the road. So substantial inequities by race, ethnicity, and income in proximity to where traffic and truck routes are. So with that, the traffic related air pollution, they contribute about 53,000 deaths in the US due to PM2.5. NO2, nitrogen dioxide, is an emerging as well as more important pollutant, responsible for about 140 to 180,000 premature mortality in the US annually, all source NO2. And on-road traffic building emissions, the top two contributors to specifically New York City, New York metropolitan statistical area. And they cause about 2,000 to 3,000 premature deaths, depending on how you count them based upon the concentration response functions supported by epidemiology. And 20% of these are due to medium and 17% due to heavy trucks. That's the contribution of these sectors. So that's why we want to understand how to understand this a little bit more carefully, what tools are needed to model them, and how we can perhaps come up with mitigation factors. So there are tools such as the EPA's COBRA model. COBRA stands for the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Model, which allows you to do quick health impact assessment for PM2.5 ozone, but does not do for NO2. And then we need high resolution modeling tools, which can perhaps take into account all the processes, all the inputs, and then find hotspots where we have very high air pollution exposures and come up with targeted emission reduction measures for regulatory decision-making purposes. A quick example of how important New York City. I try to compare New York City with Buenos Aires, where we are today. On the left is the map of Buenos Aires, and the right is New York City. You see a rough comparison of the two cities in terms of area. New York City is about 6 times larger than Buenos Aires. It has about 3 times more the population, but the density is slightly less in the core New York City 5-county region here, as well as the core city of Buenos Aires. If you go larger to the New York metropolitan statistical area, which is about 25 different counties, and the larger MABA, as I've heard as the name, for the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, the density goes down a little bit in Buenos Aires compared to New York City. So roughly you get an idea of how large the cities are and how much population are there in these cities. Now, for models, those of us who use modeling tools for air pollution assessments, you use these grid-based models. Some of us may be familiar with. You discretize the domain, in a virtual manner with some imaginary grid squares. If you use a grid square at 12 by 12 kilometer resolution over New York City, you can see those big blobs of air pollution. And basically what you have is, the entire city of New York is in 5 grid squares, right? So you have this big blob of air pollution focused on 12 by 12 kilometers. But then where people live really is different from that grid square. If you look at the map on the right, it's a population distribution in New York City, which varies quite a bit across the 5-borough area of New York City. And each polygon is a zip code. Okay, so New York City is divided about 200 zip codes roughly, exactly as 192 zip codes. And if you take this to a next level of spatial resolution, what are called the census tracts, which are even finer resolution, you have about 2,191 census tracts. So you have much smaller spatial units within which people live. And the demographics of people across these tracts are very different, okay, by race, by income, by ethnicity. They are very different. And the exposures they have to air pollution are also very different depending on where the roads are. So spatial resolution is important. So the overall goal of the tool that I'm going to talk about, which we developed earlier called ZAPA. ZAPA is Zip Code Air Pollution Policy Assessment Tool, which integrated 2 tools. One is C-Tools that my group at UNC developed with the EPA, and then the COBRA model I mentioned earlier. It brings the two together in one web-based, easy-to-use modeling framework, add custom high-resolution input data sets for emissions, for health incidents and population in New York City to allow for a very fine-grained local scale analysis at the track level, and then perform rapid evaluation of various policy options using a web-based approach. That's sort of what we did with ZAPA. It was published 3 years ago in the Shukla et al. Paper. But then we started thinking, saying, this is fine, but we need to go into even more higher resolution. Then came TRAPPA. TRAPPA is just changing the Z from T. Z is zip code, T is TRAPPA, T is tract. So we refined the spatial resolution to go from zip code to census tract. And just to give you a flavor, the US, you see the state of California, and that's one county, and then within a county, that's one tract. Okay, that's sort of the spatial resolution. And within a tract, you can also go down even finer, look at blocks, block groups, and that's where the resolution goes down even more. But in this tool, we'll model at a tract level resolution. And the goal of the study, what I'll talk about today, is assess the health benefits of two different transportation policies. The first one to look at how we may convert all medium heavy trucks, the big 18-wheeler trucks, from burning diesel fuel to electric-based fuels by 2050. And the second one to implement a very rather revolutionary policy in New York City is called the congestion pricing scheme. I'm not sure if you have heard of that. This is a very novel, first of a kind policy in the US. Other countries have done a little bit earlier. London did it earlier. I think Copenhagen has it too. For the US, this is the first policy, where I'll talk about it more. We'll see how to implement congestion pricing in downtown Manhattan in New York City and what that may lead to in terms of health benefits and air pollution benefits. So what are C tools? This is where we talk about dispersion. So C tools are web-based screening tools. You have preloaded inputs of emissions, the emission meteorology to do the dispersion, and you have individual algorithms for modeling each type of source. You have either cars and trucks on the highway modeled as a line source. Rail sources also modeled as a line source algorithm. Area sources, these are very small sources which you cannot capture individually. So you combine all of them together and model as an area polygon. Then you also model line source, the ships. You have the large cargo ships, like I see a port here right in Buenos Aires. The ships carry large cargo. They also burn pretty dirty fuel. These ships are moving. You want the ships to have lines of plume, right? So that you capture the plume buoyancy and then the dispersion at downwind distances. Then the major point sources are terminal, depending on what type of source you have. You model the stack as an individual point source. So you have unique algorithm for modeling each type of source in the model. And this has been published in multiple papers over the years in how we develop the C-tools model. COBRA, that's the EPA risk assessment health impact screening tool. What COBRA does is takes emissions at a county level for each county in the US. And if you model a change in emissions at a county scale, it takes a change in emissions and then combines it to estimate change in air quality, calculate the change in health risk, and puts a dollar value, a monetized value on that. That's what COBRA does, the EPA tool. But it works at the county scale. So what we did was bring the two tools together, C tools with just local scale dispersion, COBRA which does this, and come up with a new web-based tool. And I'll walk you through the emissions chart just to give you a flavor for how large the emissions are. I have 5 different precursors for PM2.5, from directly emitted PM on the top left to oxides of nitrogen, ammonia, VOCs, and SO2. And you get a sense of how large the emissions are and where the hotspots are in different parts of the city for different pollutants. Then you can also look at the relative magnitude of various sectors in New York City. If you look at the middle group of bars, which is the NOx emissions, you see that NOx is fairly high in New York City. Queens borough has about 16,000 tons, but the red chunk of the bars show the amount of highway vehicles or on-road emissions. And you see those emissions are fairly large. Each of the counties, you have about 20-30% of each county's emissions being total highway vehicles. The second I highlight is the fuel conversion other, which is building emissions. Okay, buildings in New York City consume a lot of energy, and they use fuel oil, and those oil emissions are what is captured here as fuel conversion other. That's a very large component of New York's emissions budget as well. Okay, now let's look at truck traffic. That's New York City. At each line segment you see there is a highway which shows the truck traffic, and it shows the strength of the truck traffic in terms of number of trucks per day. It's called the annual average daily traffic, AADT. You see the color coding going from somewhere in the 1,000 to over 20,000 plus. So on one segment, you have more than 20,000 trucks going through that particular line segment. So the distribution of trucks is not uniform across the city. So what we tried to model was, as part of this assessment we did some time back, we came up with the electrification scenario where we assume that all truck sales in New York City will be EV by 2030. And then convert them slowly from 30 to 40, where by the year 2040, all the fleet, the entire fleet in New York City for trucks is electric. Okay, that's the scenario we model. And the second scenario is what I talked about as the congestion pricing. So basically what we have here is the middle part shows the greenish colors parts of New Jersey. Right in the middle of the picture is New York City. And in terms of number of vehicles in New York City, about 1.5 million packages are delivered in New York City per day. Okay, so think of the volume of trucks that are coming in New York City based upon the fairly large number, 1.5 million packages delivered in New York City per day. How many people move in? If you look at the bottom left figure, 7.5 million people come into New York City per day. Okay, that's the floating population. I think Buenos Aires is 3.1 million people. So twice as much people as the population of Buenos Aires come into New York City every day for various reasons, right? That's the amount of traffic that's flowing in. And if you look at the map here, that shows this is Manhattan, and then Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, and so on. So the plan was, the congestion pricing plan is to limit traffic coming into Manhattan by saying everything south of this street, it's called 60th Street, everything south of the street, if you want to enter that area of the central business district of New York City, you have to pay a toll. That's the congestion pricing plan. The toll was $15 per vehicle per entry. It was heavily argued, it was heavily debated. There's a lot of tension between the local government, the state government, and the federal government, and so on and so forth. I'm going to leave politics out of this. At the end of this, we'll look at the impact of this policy. So the goal was to see what will happen if you limit traffic coming into the city by putting a congestion price, $15 per vehicle per entry.
15
and then
or 15?
1.5, yeah. Okay, and that's what they looked at different numbers and settled on $15. That's what we had. And after a lot of debate, it was implemented earlier this year. From January 2025, we have this in place right now, but there's a debate going on the benefits of it. Okay, so that's the congestion pricing plan. So the overall TRAPPA framework is, you want to start with meteorological inputs, because for dispersion you need where the meteorology is coming from to do the profiling. You capture source inventories by region for a base case or reference case, and then policy scenarios. And then you have dispersion of the local sources in the region, so that you know where the pollutants move without chemistry. Then you estimate secondary PM2.5 based upon some reduced form algorithms that we have, instead of going through very detailed chemistry, which may take a long time. Then you estimate the transported component of PM, which comes from outside the city into the city, because you also have convection and transport happening in the atmosphere. You bring them all together. Then you get a total PM2.5 for the base case in the policy case. Compute the change in PM2.5. Once you have a change, you have an epidemiology-based concentration response function, which helps you to estimate the health impacts or the health benefits of the change in concentrations, which could be from premature mortality, asthma, hospital admission. There's a long list of health impacts one can assess. And finally, you put a dollar value on each of them. So what is the total benefit? So that's the methods of how these tools work, from changes in emissions to dollars. So initially, TRAPPA was only focused on PM2.5, but then based upon a lot of other research and motivation, we expanded TRAPPA to also model NO2. Okay, this is new work we've done in only the past few years, past few months, and I'll walk over the methods for NO2 shortly. Feel free to stop if you have any questions. I'm happy to stop and clarify anything. So how do you split PM2.5? I gave a schematic on the last slide. This is a little more of chemistry here on this slide. C2, this is the dispersion on the top left for basic primary pollutants, just to do the dispersion. Then COBRA gives the transported concentration of how much pollution comes from outside the city into the city. It gives primary PM2.5, sulfate aerosol, nitrate aerosol, ammonium aerosol, and so on. Then we take these concentrations and then we combine the two to get the total concentration of PM2.5, to get the total ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, and ammonium bisulfate in the region. Then we also have the locally produced primary PM2.5 and SOA from the VOCs that are oxidized to go on to form secondary organic aerosols. We bring them all together, and then we have total PM, which is a combination of locally produced pollution as well as transported pollution as well as atmospheric chemistry. Right? That's all three components mixed together. At the end, we have total PM2.5 in that particular spatial unit, which is the census tract. Okay? And then once you do this for one census tract, one spatial unit, you can do this for all the grid cells, and that's what goes on.
So this is about the emissions, but then the export of the loss of these gases is just advection, or is.
So you have locally produced emissions first.
Yes.
We transport them or disperse them. Then you also have some of them go on to form atmospheric chemistry and form secondary PM.
Okay.
Then things get moved from outside the domain into the domain,
Okay.
and then they get combined together.
But then when they come, do you lose the? So this is the income.
This is first. Yeah.
The outcome.
There's no outcome.
There's no outcome.
There's no outcome. Yeah. In this, there's no loss process that you're asking. Okay, good, really, really good question. Yeah. So then the NO2 part a little more complex. I have a few slides on this. So for this, we had to develop a new NO2 source receptor matrix. We started the emission matrix in the EPA, and then we identified specific non-point elevated point sources for developing what is called a source receptor matrix. A source receptor matrix basically saying for the entire country, from every county to every other county, how much pollution can go from one to the other and form new pollution. Okay, and for that you had to come up with some pretty detailed calculations to come up with that. So we did this in immense modeling. We did this offline using the comprehensive CMAQ model called Community Multi-Scale Air Quality Model, and we performed hundreds of simulations at a fairly coarse of 12 kilometers, and then we identified 440 generic sources, 110 generic point sources, and so on, and did the modeling. I'll show a map in a second. Okay. And we had a bunch of criteria how to come up with these unique sources. Here's a map of US. Every dot shows this, what I call a generic source. So we identified based upon satellite data where we have high hotspots of NO2 from the tropospheric column, then where the crystals have high coefficients of variation, then large emissions, and to make sure they are somewhat distributed away from each other, so they're not close to each other, and then make sure that point source and points, the distance also somewhat different between the strength and the distance. And then in New York City, with the focus of the study, we also put more sources in the New York City region, so we kind of capture this transfer matrix pretty carefully there. At the end, we do this modeling where we had 573 generic sources into 105 CMAQ simulations, and to make sure these sources are far apart, and we mix all these sources at the end, the sensitivity case minus base case gives you the impact of a single source. Okay, so now of all the 573 sources, we can tell what is the contribution from one of the 573 sources on every other grid cell in the domain. And that was done through some pretty intense modeling. It took us a few months to get this done. At the end, what we have is this source receptor matrix, which allows you to understand from any one grid cell what is the impact of that source on the remaining grid cells. Okay. And here is the general process. We start with emissions on the left, county level NOx emissions, and then at the end, what we have is a grid cell level NO2 concentration outputs from the SRM of the source receptor matrix, and that's being written up for publication. We submit it pretty soon. And then we also evaluated this against observations. If you look at this, on the left is the month of January, and the right is the month of July, winter versus summer, and we evaluated what the source receptor matrix gave compared to routine observations from the US EPA. And we see the model performs quite well actually. The mean SRM was 10.08 for January, and the mean AQS is 11.22, and for July it's 9.23 and 5.94. We thought overall we did pretty well. But for sake of this tool, we are doing annual average modeling. So we take these 2 seasons and average them. And to go from here to finally for the TRAPPA tool, what we have to do is if you look at the top box there, background NOx, we start from background NOx, then we do the local scale dispersion of NOx from New York City receptors, then we get the local NOx, we add the two to get the total NOx, and then we have a very simple conversion to go from NOx to NO2 using a polynomial regression coefficient. This was done in the UK, scientists Dixon, Middleton, Derwinton about 15 years ago, 24 years ago. They came up with an algorithm for this regression approach. We adapted the same approach, except what we did was we brought a new 10 years worth of data from all NOx NO2 observations in the US, and we came with a new regression. And all this goes into estimating NO2 here. We do this for the base case, for the sensitivity case, the delta, and then goes to health maximum. So this is the method we came for modeling NO2, which was not there in COBRA, but we implemented for the study. All right, now on to the results. The first one, transportation point number 1, where we rectify all medium humidity trucks. What you see on this slide is, on the left is the PM2.5 change, right? That is, you have a base case, you rectify all the trucks, and what is the change? On the right is similar plot for NO2. If you look at the scale of these two plots, the left goes from 0 to about 0.7 or so microgram per cubic meter. On the right is 0 to 14 so microgram per cubic meter. Those are fairly large numbers in terms of absolute concentration change. So what we see in this set of plots is there's a wide variation in distribution of air quality benefits from medium humidity electrification across stacks. And what we also saw was, besides just the change, the census stack with the top 20% benefits, which means more change, they are 2 to 13 times higher than the median in the entire state. Okay, which means the highest tracks got the most benefits, which is what we want. Okay, and we saw that pretty consistently in these two, and this has been published already in Environmental Research Health Journal. And just a little bit more. Last slide was concentrations. Now you take concentration and go to health impacts, right? So here is health impacts, which is looking at the deaths avoided in scenario 2, which is the second scenario where we electrify everything by the year 2040. And here I normalize this by 100,000 on a per capita basis. On the top left is PM2.5, on the right is NO2, and the scale goes from deeper color, which is almost zero, to lighter color, which is high change. And what we see from these two figures is NO2 reductions are important. In fact, they dominate the overall health impacts. In terms of benefits, if you take these changes in health and put a dollar value on them, you end up with about $2.4 billion in benefits from truck fleet electrification in New York City. 85% of the mortality benefits are from NO2. 97% of asthma benefits are also from NO2. So NO2 is an important pollutant. The census tracts with the large minority population by race have 35% of total childhood attributable asthma ED, despite being only small population. So basically what we're saying is smaller population census tracts with a large minority population get a lot of benefits from this policy. The last one, 23% of the total NO2 impacts can be avoided by truck fleet electrification. So this basically shows that electrifying trucks in New York City based upon the emissions that I showed earlier is an important policy driver, which could be implemented, and then hopefully by 2040, we have these benefits realized for real in New York City. Okay? Again, like I said, this has been published already. Second one is work in progress, the congestion pricing. In this one, I talked about the general plan, which is you're putting a $15 toll on trucks entering downtown Manhattan. And what you have here is, this is Manhattan. Okay? This is Manhattan where, and that's Central Park, and basically you have vehicles entering south of this region being charged a $15 toll. So to avoid that, people still have to come to city somehow to do their business, right? Either you park your car somewhere and take the public transportation or whatever you have to do, or figure out how you do your business, right? So now based upon what we saw was, this is work that was done by the local Metropolitan Transit Authority with the US Federal Highway Administration. The report is published. We took assumptions from them in terms of how traffic will move with a traffic demand model and converted how they expected VMT, vehicle miles traveled, to change. And we incorporated this into TRAPPA. So basically what we see is the red and blues shows how traffic may change based upon imposition of congestion pricing for Manhattan. Okay? So we propagated this change in DMT based upon the study's assumptions and saw what this will mean for air pollution change and then health benefits. Okay? So here are the results. First one, congestion pricing changes in PM and NO2, similar to the couple of slides ago. Left is PM, right is NO2. And what you see is the blues are generally benefits, which mean the pollutant is being reduced. Red is disbenefits, which mean pollutant is going up because of traffic rerouting. So what you see there is the PM change could be from a benefit of a quarter microgram per cubic meter to about 0.2 micrograms, which is an increase somewhere in the city. And for NO2, you may have benefits of up to 2.7 micrograms and a disbenefit of up to 0.84 micrograms for NO2. That's what we see from this congestion pricing policy. Then if we translate this to dollars, we see benefits of about $10 to $24 million for PM2.5, $12 million for NO2, and total monetized health benefits are in the range of $22 to $36 million. Okay, so this is just finished up and writing it up and should be submitting pretty soon, hopefully this month. But as of now, I'll still call it draft because it's not published yet. With that, what we have is a high-resolution modeling tool called TRAPPA, which we use to model a census tract scale to evaluate two real-world transportation policies in New York City. Policy number one, the fleet electrification will have significant air pollution health benefits in New York City. Full on-road electrification by 2040 would prevent 248 deaths, $2.4 billion in benefit, and direct NO2 benefits are much larger. They're about 85 to 90% of total benefits in New York City. Second one, for the congestion pricing, airport health benefits highly variable and skewed. 20% of the tracks in New York City contribute to 28-80% total NO2, 1 to 7 total PM2.5. The congestion pricing, while it gives overall net benefits in New York City, you will see the increase in emissions health impacts sometimes are outside the city. I showed this blue versus the red, right? So there are some disbenefits on there. So it may exacerbate environmental justice issues due to inequitable exposures, but we plan to revise the assessment once we get real traffic data because we want to get at least 1 year's worth of data. We started January 2025, wait for about a year to get real traffic data to see how traffic has been affected beyond the initial assumptions by the FHWA study I mentioned, right? So we'll look for real data analysis again. But notwithstanding limitations, I think tools like TRAPPA that you heard earlier today offer strong potential to evaluate such policies for decision makers to inform, improve air quality and health. Okay. With that, I would like to expand to other cities. We've done some of them. We did one to Atlanta. When we did the truck-free certificate study, we studied both New York and Atlanta, but Atlanta results were not written up then. Then we have an interactive tool for that Fort Worth. That is another very large city in the US. They have a lot of traffic issues. People in Texas like to drive a lot of roads, a lot of cars, right? So we have a tool for Dallas Fort Worth. And then very recently, the New York State was working on a state energy plan, and they wanted a tool like this to do this at a very local scale from census tract to block to resolution. So we developed a tool called CHAPPA. CHAPPA's Community Health Air Pollution Policy Assessment Tool. And that's being customized, and we are writing this up right now with some results for the state. Okay, and that should be submitted this month as well. Beyond these US efforts, I would like to expand this to other cities of the world, including right here. So expand other cities with large transportation-related air pollution. What we need is emissions at a high resolution. That's number one, right? And then traffic data, if you can, on the major highways. If you can get at a link level to see what is your daily average vehicular traffic, and then break down by fleet. You want to know what is the fleet mix, which is cars versus trucks at the minimum. But then if you go beyond that to see what fuel they are burning, natural gas, gasoline, diesel, EV, and so on. I also need population baseline health incidence data. So you need to aggregate, disaggregate the population to some spatial units, which is at a high resolution. And meteorological data, I assume that's probably the easiest one to get, like if you're able to drive dispersion. At the end, once you have all the 3 data sets, you put together the base front end, like I'm going to show in a second, which empowers the policymakers, all the stakeholder assets, what are scenarios. Okay, all of this is being done through a web-based tool. That's how we designed this. Okay, there's a lot of science in the back end, but we empower the users to do this from a web-based front end. So non-technical people can really use this very. And that's a screenshot. It's the URL is publicly available. You're all welcome to use it and break it and see if something doesn't work. I'm happy to hear feedback and fix as needed. You can access this tool. And with Professor Andrea's initiatives, tomorrow we're going to have an interactive demonstration of this tool in the immersive room in the other building. I believe it's the Zero Infinity building, right? Immersive room. So she can give you more details. So it's 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. And it's, I believe there is a seating capacity of 15 or so. So we welcome people.
We need to know who is interested so we can.
Okay. So I plan to give an interactive demo of this tool and how you can set up and run the model. It takes 15-20 minutes to run. So I won't bore you all to sit there looking at the screen for 20 minutes. What I will do is I'll give a demo where I show you how to set this up and how to look at results from a pre-run scenario. Okay. That's a tool. You're welcome to use it on your own. And that's my team, both at UNC, a lot of people worked on this. Then I have a very strong collaborator from New York City Department of Health who provided data, both from emissions perspective as well as from a health perspective. And then Act Global is another collaborator. Then for the electric vehicle pricing study, we collaborated with Boston University School of Public Health and EDF funded part of that, Ananya Roy and B. Sutherland. And also want to acknowledge Kurt Baker of the US EPA and the US EPA in general, because they put together the national emission inventories to do work like this. Beyond this is more of a sales pitch for a conference that's coming up. I just want to introduce something else. You heard introduction. We have at UNC the CMAS Center. I direct the center at UNC. CMAS is the Community Modeling Analysis System. This has been in operation for 25 years at UNC. Okay, what we do is we support the global community on the use of various emissions air quality models. We support that through working with the EPA on the model development, model application, model testing. But more importantly, we host a conference at UNC every fall. We've been doing this every year, the past 24 years, except this October for a couple of other reasons. But next year, we're going to have our 25th annual edition. I'll talk about it in a second. What that map shows is the number of attendees from various countries of the world at the CMAS conference in 2024. It also shows another data point, which is the color codes reflect the number of users of these models from various countries of the world. course, US is the largest user, no more than 2,835 users are in the US. But you see the growing presence of this model where countries of the world using this for science, for regulation, for policy making, and so on and so forth. That's a community that we support through the CIMA Center. And like I said, we host training for both the SMOKE and the CMAC models every year. Those are the last 2 rounds of training we hosted at UNC, but it's virtual, which means you can be sitting in your office right here in the conference. We get people from all over the world taking these trainings, virtual trainings. And then beyond hosting the conference at UNC Chapel Hill, we've started to expand the conference to host both in South America and in Asia. So the last 5 editions of the South America conference were held in Brazil/Colombia as part of our expansion of the CIMA South American community. And the next edition of that is coming up next year in Brazil, Victoria Espírito Santo. Please, look out for the dates. I'm sure she'll be distributing more in the institute of the department. It's right here in Brazil, right? I welcome you all to come there. Before that, come to Chapel Hill for looking at the 25th annual edition of the conference in Chapel Hill. We hope to have a nice big blast. I welcome you all to come, present your work, and meet people of the world who are also doing similar work and make connections with them. Okay? I think that's my last slide, and I'm happy to take it.
Thank you. And may show your talk, and I think that is very important to show this kind of example where to build scientific evidence to take, I think, better decisions informed in what our knowledge say that we is changing when we take one policy or another. So it's very important. So we have some time for questions here, or also if there is some info.
Yes. Julian Hellman, I will read it for you. Thank you very much, very interesting. Is it possible to improve controlling this estimation with measurements? PM2.5, secondary inorganic ions, NOx. In Buenos Aires, we have a few monitoring sites for PM2.5 and NOx, and maybe one sampling site with PM2.5 chemistry for some periods.
Yeah, if I understood the question right, the question is, can I improve this with measurements? Measurements are needed to validate the model, but what the model does is allow you to make a base estimate of what we think is the reality, compare the observations and measurements and validate them. Once you do that, what the tool allows you to do is do a what if happens, right? You cannot do that with measurements. That's the beauty of model. With a tool like this, you can ask, what if I do X, Y, or Z, like the 2 policies model, and see what will happen. But measurements are important to first validate the model. We did extensive validation of the modeling in New York City before we went into the policy options. So those measurements are very important. I would like that, but we need to go beyond measurements to do what ifs, and that's the tool.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, and I like it very much. I was wondering what is the contribution of background to what comes from outside of the city of New York? Is it important?
Yeah, very, very important. And I didn't go into the details, but in the paper we are writing up, we are trying to break that down and show how much of NO2 that we have in the city is coming from background. And that's where the source receptor matrix is important. That shows what is coming from outside the city into the city. And then I add the locally produced NO2 on top of that, right? If I remember the numbers right, it's about 60 to 70%, I think, is what I recall as the transport NO2 coming in the city, but it depends on location. But that's a rough estimate of role of background NO2 on local NO2.
One more question. Is the effect of buildings included to account for the
Yeah, great question. I think you're talking about the canopy effect for buildings.
Yeah, for the wind.
Yeah, no, we did not. In the development of C-tools, the paper that I showed earlier 7 years ago, we did not get to that part. So right now they are not incorporated. That's a limitation of the law. Hopefully we will enhance them later on to bring the canopy effect for that. That's a great question. That's an area of research we just haven't got today. Yeah, of course.
My question was, if there are already cities or cities that have gone through these transitions that can be used as real examples of your scenarios. Now, so I'm not 100% sure, but earlier this year I got a call from Shanghai. He told me that many cars are electrical nowadays in Shanghai. Not sure how real is that, but maybe there are cities, or maybe Singapore is like that, cities that have already gone through this electrification of vehicles, or have to maybe some of your scenarios into action, and if there are real examples of the scenario.
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't done that as part of this study, but there are other studies that I've seen where on a nationwide basis, it's called dynamic evaluation, where people are evaluated. For example, the Clean Air Act is one of the most important acts in the US. That was promulgated in 1970, and then 1990 was amendments, and then EPA did what is called a retrospective study to look back to see what happened in time and some of the emission reductions were. And they used the CMAC air quality model to do this retrospective evaluation, and there are some results coming out of that. We haven't done this with these new scenarios, but I think it's a great suggestion to add to some of what you're doing down the road. Maybe apply it to Singapore or somewhere else and see what happens. Yeah, we haven't done that in the study. But the other regional scale models, there are studies that have done this called dynamic evaluation.
So, and the other question that I have is that in the cost account, in the cost, your cost balance, you don't have the cost of the transition of the policy, you know? So you're not taking into account converting the truck to electric.
That's correct. Yeah.
That's
purely health. Costs are not included in this assessment, but in the Clean Air Act Amendment, the one I talked about earlier, they have done this on a nationwide basis. And the typical number I've seen is 30-1, where by the year 2020, the benefits accrued in the US due to health-based emissions regulations overcome costs by a ratio of 30-1. A nationwide number, right? I haven't done this for the local scale study, but that's a good suggestion, and we can look at this to see what the costs are. But what I've done is purely quantify the health-based benefits of reducing emissions.
Here on Zoom, Ricieri Pedrucci, you can talk if you want.
Okay. Hi, Sarav, it's Izzy here. How are you?
Hey, Izzy, how are you?
I'm doing fine. This COBRA model that you'll be using from US EPA, is it look like BEMAP, for example, or they use the cost benefits and health like?
Yeah, it's very similar to BEMAP, except that COBRA does only at a county scale. So till about 1 year or so ago, it was only doing PM2.5, and they just revised the source data matrix with the new modeling that they did and it's published last year, which had both PM and ozone. But the model is very similar to BEMAP, except BEMAP is a lot more customizable. But COBRA is sort of a box that you get either for a desktop or a web-based version. But the concepts are very similar. But the extra beauty of COBRA is gives you the source data matrix, which BEMAP does not. BEMAP relies on you, Izzy, to come up with the change in air pollution from either observation or from a model. But COBRA has the source data matrix, and you can use that to come up with your own scenario.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm asking that because we are planning to develop like a study, a link level to try to, similar as you did in Manhattan, is to change the bus fleet in Rio, try to avoid the air pollutants and also emissions from greenhouse gases. So the Rio is very focused on this right now, have like a project called Brief Cities, who join like different people from Europe and also from Rio, try to develop it. So I thought very interesting, especially if you go at link level and to find the solutions to apply tolls to avoid people coming to center. So that's similar stuff that we want to do in Rio as well. So very interesting work.
Thank you.
Let's chat later about it.
Yeah, happy to chat with you further. So you know where to reach me. Breed Cities, I'm glad Rio is part of that. Wasn't there an event that ended last week or so on Breed Cities in Rio? I saw some posts on that. But I'm very happy to hear that Rio is considering doing something like this and you're looking for tools. I'm happy to chat with you to see what more we can do to help you to do something like this in Rio.
For sure. Let's talk about it. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Good to hear you.
Good to hear from you too.
And so the last time I saw the presentation, I'm a little bit jealous on the amount of information you have on the missions and the amount of data is I think it's always amazing on the amount of information that you have in the universities. And so my question is that maybe it will be difficult to apply these models in Buenos Aires, where we are a little bit, I would say, more lazy with the amount of information that we gather. And but still, if you think New York is or these studies can be like results can be taken as for Buenos Aires, no? So it's I understand that the cost will be different, but still the difference between the two scenarios will be applicable in qualitatively to Buenos Aires. You think?
I think qualitative at a zeroth order, we can say that if I have X number of vehicles, you electrify them, you get something like this at a zeroth order estimate. But I think you want to go beyond that, to go to at least a first order estimate by getting real ground level data. I understand that there are challenges in getting the data, but we have to start somewhere and to really see what efforts are needed to start to compile data. But I really think the motivation should be on the lines of what I have in the study, which says, if I do this policy, I have so much in health benefits, right? I think that's the message. And if you are convinced that that's a relevant message based upon peer review, then we need to see what do we need to start the process to start from permissions from other data sets and start to build them one at a time. Okay, but the general message is, yeah, you can take the zeroth order information from there and say, if I electrify, 10,000 vehicles, I'm going to have X amount of health benefits in the region. But I think we want to go beyond.
Maybe this type of model also you need to prioritize some area because you have more vulnerable populations. You need to know where do you have the hotspots and where does these emissions come from. So yeah, so far these results cannot be extrapolated to other cities.
So you think it could be you can from the emissions like so you mentioned like there are many sources of emissions. You think you can say okay, let's say it will be hard to get all this information from Buenos Aires, let's say, but you can say which are the essentials of all these emissions. Like, okay, so to start, the first step will be just buses and construction.
Yeah, that's a good question. The other way to look at this is there are global inventories, right? People have compiled, but they are a little bit coarser, or a lot more coarser than what you need. But they'll be a good starting point to say, okay, globally, the countries of the world have put together this EDGAR inventory, the HTAP inventory, some of the multiple inventories. You can look at it to see what is the resolution of that particular global inventory. They may be at a 0.1 degree or 1 degree or 1 degree and so on. But then you can look at it because they do break down by sector. You can look at that and see from that estimate for the country of Argentina, what is the relative contribution of different sectors. That may give you a sense of where the key contributions are. And then go down to saying, okay, if let's say 80% of emissions of NOx are from transportation, that's where you want to put your focus. Then let's switch to construction. For primary PM, directly emitted PM2.5, they said from construction, that's the emission, that's 90%. Then for that pollutant, you want to look at construction. So there is a starting point you can go with and then see where you want to put more emphasis.
Another question?
No.
Well, I think that we have enough questions.
I'm happy. I came here to talk, so I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks again. If anyone have another question, then I'm sure that you will be happy to answer them. So thanks a lot, Sarav, again for giving this talk. I think that was very interesting, and we don't have much talk about
Air quality.
air quality, and so I think that was nice to have your talk. And well, thanks a lot, and we have a seminar next week, so wait for the we wait you for the next seminar. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you all. And like we said earlier, demonstration tomorrow on the commercial fancy big screen, 1:30 p.m.